I love reading the Gospels. Mark instills a sense of urgency. Luke calls me to compassion. John opens me to the wonder of the mystery of God. All of them are great, and if you're interested in diving into any of these three, I've made videos about each of them, which can be found up here. But in this video, we're talking about Matthew, the Gospel of Righteousness. For many people, Matthew is the Gospel. It's the first in the canon because it is the bridge between the Old and New Testaments, offers the most comprehensive structure of Jesus' identity and life, is meticulously crafted, and from the beginning of the church was often regarded as people's favorite. There's a reason that the creators of the show The Chosen portray Matthew as a little on the spectrum. This gospel has chiastic structures on top of chiastic structures, making it truly a masterpiece of writing. Meaning that some short YouTube video from someone who doesn't have a PhD in Matthew's writing will inevitably leave some things out, but 4 major points are worth focusing on. That Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises, his disciples are called to perfect virtue, going beyond the law, the kingdom of heaven is not inherited and so is open to anyone who does the Father's will, and Jesus is the presence of God always with us. Let's start with the Old Testament. For a Jew of the first century, which was Matthew's intended audience, there are 2 significant historical figures that reign over the rest. Moses, the great prophet who taught the people who God was and how they were to live, and David, the anointed king of God who united the kingdom and offered promise of restoration. Jesus is the new Moses and the new David. We see this from the very beginning with the genealogy. There are 14 generations listed between Abraham and David, 14 generations from David to the exile, and 14 generations from the exile to Jesus, where he was born in Bethlehem, the town of David from which the Messiah will come. Jesus is the heir of David, and more than that, he is the threefold David. 14 is the numeric value of the letters DVD, the name of David. This new King David and his kingdom is one that will upset the current order and create jealousy in worldly rulers, which is why, when Jesus is born, Herod tries to kill all the boys under the age of 2, just like when Moses was born. Jesus and the family must flee to Egypt, not just to flee violence, but so that God can call his people out of Egypt once more to bring salvation, led by the new teacher, the new Moses. This new David and his kingdom is one that will upset the current order and create jealousy in worldly rulers, which is why, when he is born, Herod tries to kill all the boys under the age of 2, just like when Moses was born. Jesus and his family must flee to Egypt, not just to escape violence, but so that God can call his people out of Egypt once more to bring salvation, led by a new Moses. Throughout his ministry, there is a constant allusion made between Jesus and these 2 leaders, always with the intention of promoting Jesus beyond them. Moses taught on the mountain. Jesus gives a new teaching as transfigured on a mountain. Moses divided the Red Sea and gave manna from heaven. Jesus walked on water and fed 5,000 with only a few loaves. David rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus was greeted with shouts of jubilation on Palm Sunday. Moses mediated a covenant between God and the people, but Jesus is the new covenant. In each of these ways, Jesus took what had been revealed before and not only brought fulfillment, but added to it. He went beyond what David and Moses did, for he wasn't just another David or another Moses, but the very one who gave David and Moses their authority in the first place as a divine being. Jesus is the one revealed to be the source of authority, which is why his teaching goes beyond the law that Moses prescribed. In each of his 5 sermons, beginning with the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls the world to moral excellence, to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. It is not enough for him to avoid murder. A true disciple avoids anger and hatred as well. It is not enough to avoid adultery. A true disciple avoids lust in his heart. It is not enough to avoid retaliation. A true disciple loves his enemies. For Jesus, the law as an external control of one's behavior is but a bare minimum for morality, and it ultimately cannot save one from sin or death. Only Jesus, the source of all authority, the true teacher and true king, can save, and he will only save those who strive to enter through the narrow gate. More than in any other gospel, there is a distinct sense of judgment and punishment for those who are not righteous, who live arrogantly apart from God. No one can read Matthew and think, yeah, I'm a sinner, but I'll be all right. God is love, and he wants everyone to go to heaven. Not exactly. For better or for worse, I believe that the Gospel of Matthew is meant to unsettle us a bit, to force us to look at our lives and realize that we are not ready for the kingdom, and no exceptions will be made. Shape up or ship out, which, as you can imagine, becomes a pretty big sticking point between Jesus and the Pharisees, but really Jesus and the entire people of Israel. Don't assume that just because Abraham is your father that you'll be welcomed to the kingdom of heaven. In chapter 7, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven." Given Matthew's audience, this is clearly directed at the Jewish people who claim to love God but do not live with righteousness. Jesus makes this point crystal clear and raises tensions with a number of his parables. One son says yes to the Father but then disobeys, the other son says no but then does the Father's will. Only the latter will be saved. A great banquet was held with many notable invited guests, but they didn't show up. So they were placed with lepers and the homeless, and the door was locked. The tenant farmers believed that they could hold on to the land without giving any produce, even abusing the king's stewards and killing his son. They were rounded up and killed, and the farm was given to those who would carry out the king's orders. In each case, Jesus in Matthew's gospel is reminding the Jewish people that salvation will pass by them and it will be given to the Gentiles if they don't act with righteousness. Salvation is not for people of a particular status or ethnic group, but for anyone who does the will of God through a righteous life. Which is why the gospel ends, after his resurrection and before his ascension, with Jesus commissioning the apostles to make disciples of all nations. It's not just for the Jews. His kingdom is open for all people. Thankfully, this is a task not just for the apostles alone, but is the work of the church, an institution founded by Jesus in which Jesus' presence will rest forever. From the very first chapter until the very last verse, Matthew emphasizes the fact that Jesus is the presence of God, accessible to all who believe. He is called Emmanuel at his birth, the God who is with us. He teaches that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is there in their midst. And when the disciples serve the poor and outcast, they don't just do it to the needy, they do it to him. The church is the embodiment of that presence today, built on the faith of St. Peter and the continued witness of the successors of the apostles. As Jesus' followers, we need not go on the road alone, for we are united together through him. No other gospel mentions the church, that continued source of authority drawing us to righteousness and the always available fountain of truth, enlightening us with truth. There's a reason that it has been the fan favorite since the beginning. Of course, the other Gospels are pretty good too. Maybe you want to feel the urgency of the mission. Read Mark. Bring healing to the broken. Read Luke. Or enter the vast mystery of God. Read John.